Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or channels. This is S.C. Coleman, author. Today we're going to be talking about two main subjects, but as with most of these things, they sort of go together, and you could perhaps put them together into the subheading, the operations or strategy of the financier enemy, or whatever you want to call it. So the main thing here is to cover the general idea of finance, a little bit of historical background, and then of course the identification of that enemy. Most people are taught through the mechanisms set up by particular financial actors or elements that finance is all about this fictitious thing called money and how that money is managed. If you look up any definition on pretty much every online outlet, I recently attempted to use the search engine. I refuse to call it AI, Grok. It just spits out the same answers as everything else. So let's talk about what finance really is. A book that can help enlighten the subject is World Finance, 1935 to 1937, by Paul Einzig, or it'd probably be Einzig, I don't know. London, Keegan, Paul, Trench, Trubner & Co., Ltd., Broadway House, 6874 Carter Lane, EC, 1937. So it's when it was published and copyrighted, 1937. So to start with, we'll talk about a couple financial concepts. First, we have fictitious wealth. Fictitious wealth is pretty much a term you will never hear, unless, of course, you do some reading for old books that may or may not can be reduced to audiobooks. So financial wealth relates to, or fictitious wealth, mind you, are loans, stock notes, and balance sheets, things like that. Balance sheets are used to take out loans today. So you have a company valuation. The company valuation is based specifically off of the number of assets that are listed on the balance sheet, which of course means that you can gain fictitious wealth with other fictitious wealth. Now here's the reason why that's such a big deal today. It lays claim to real wealth. This leads to an imbalance and reduces the real wealth. If you have somebody with real wealth, and the definition for real wealth is anything that is usable or practical. A house's real wealth is in its ability to be used as a house. The real wealth of a bullet is in its use within a firearm. Otherwise, it doesn't really have any value. Well, real value. It doesn't have any real value. And that's where you get that word real, tangible, or real estate, and real property. When you have the overarching rule of fictitious wealth, the fictitious wealth will lay claim to real property. But a bigger problem is when you have fictitious wealth over here and fictitious wealth over here, both laying claim to the same real property. Now, you don't have any things like claims courts nowadays, because the claims courts that we have are simply fictitious corporate actors acting on behalf of the system to acquire more things for that system. That's what claims courts are. It's to enforce their own claims against things. But either way, that idea of fictitious wealth being able to lay claim to real wealth, and then a propagation of fictitious wealth create an imbalance and thus reducing that real wealth, that is a simple concept that we are finding playing out today in our faces. Next, you have standardization. such as a gold standard, this does not relate to how we are taught, but rather relates to reserves, which are used to rebalance. A reserve or a stock of something is kept so that if something were to happen, it can be rebalanced with whatever that surplus is. And the concept here you can take with old Prussia, where you would have a stock or reserve of gold or a stock or reserve of grain. Now, here's the reason why these two are important. First of all, that gold is necessary in a monetary system that uses gold and silver as payment to ensure that things like the military stay operational. You pay their wages, because when you cut their wages, I don't care how many people say things like, it's the duty or whatever, you will lose your army if they don't have wages, and you will also lose your army if they don't have any food. That's where grain comes in. Of course, in a place where you're highly dependent on grain, say like old Prussia, having a grain stock just doesn't relate to the military. It also relates to the fact that if you're dependent on it and then there is a surplus, well, actually, if there's a surplus that comes in from out of town or whatever, and then that drops the prices of grain in your country, that's an issue that's not necessarily addressed by stocks. However, if you become and have a bad harvest and you get a grain shortage, then those prices rise. Well, you can take your grain stock over here and you can bring it in and sell at a reduced price, thus rebalancing the grain price in the economy and reducing the impact of things like famine and whatnot. So that's really what stocks and reserves are for. We do not have a gold standard. I don't believe that we will have a gold standard ever again. I don't believe that metallic monetary systems are operational or even capable to be put into operation today. And it's possible that in the future we might be able to sort of drift back to something like that, but it's hard to say. It doesn't matter if Fort Knox has gold or not, essentially, because what we have going on right now and the desire to move away from cash is so that everything is done specifically and only within the realm of fictitious wealth. That means all claim to real property will be done through fictitious wealth, period. The reason why cash reserves are kept at a certain level have nothing to do with theft, because the cash itself means nothing. The production taken to make that cash, the machines, the ink, and the manpower needed to print bills of paper or to stamp metal coins, that is a cost which can be completely removed if everything is based off of digits and balance sheets. And then you have complete claim on real property by fictitious wealth. You can't take your cash wealth and use it to pay for anything anymore because they've removed that, and they of course have removed the cost of making those types of currency. The cost of making the currency is a check on the ability to, cause what's going on right now. So another thing to think about is the idea of being inflationary minded. What we have today, which is a serious problem, are inflationary minded people. And that's because the information mechanism control system propagates this word inflation continuously. And that's to induce the inflationary mind. The inflationary mind is, simply put, somebody who goes along with the deliberate raising or inflating of prices simply because they are told to do so. That's inflationary minded. Told to do so by something, either the so-called market value. Everybody else in your neighborhood raises their prices, and so do you. That's inflationary minded. Everyone else raises their prices in the community, and you keep yours at the same rate that you've had them, is not inflationary minded. if you want to cause exceptional damage by getting everybody to engage in price gouging, you have to change the definition of price gouging, which has a bad connotation, and put in the word inflation and get everyone to be inflationary minded, and thus you can cause your economic attack. It has all to do with manipulating people's mindset towards price setting. Now this brings us to the idea of a currency lever. There's a lot of things that go into this, and I've talked about things like the oil lever. If you raise prices on the, per barrel oil stock or whatever, all that stuff, then it costs more to ship products, and thus you can raise everything using the oil lever. Well, the more insidious lever has been going on for a long time, and that is the lever of the currency. This has nothing to do with the stupid and simple explanation of, oh, they're just printing more money. You don't need to print more money if you can just issue digits in a bank account. Of course, you can have a run on a bank because that bank only has so much cash reserves, and those cash reserves do not fit or suit all the different elements of fictitious wealth. And in that context, you can say that the bank's fictitious wealth outpacing the amount of real wealth or cash that they have means that they have, in fact, multiple claims on that real wealth they have. The currency lever is a little bit different. And a lot of it does have to do with manipulating the prices of things. But either way, you look at the currency lever and it comes to where you can inflate and deflate on two opposite ends and then stabilize in the middle. But either way, you'll constantly have this lever to manipulate. And here's the concept and the idea behind what this financial enemy does. They will manipulate, in order to cause crisis and an imbalance, the currency lever one way, and then they'll bring it back all the way to the other way. And then they'll stabilize it. But that doesn't take away the ability to reduce and maneuver that lever. And one of their main objectives for expansion, for retaining control, for basically any time they want to do anything, is to imbalance on purpose the economy, the state of commerce, things like that. This does not always apply in the same way because you have different types of money. You can use this inflationary, deflationary stabilization lever in reference to metals. And you can also use it in reference to fictitious digital currency made on balance sheets. It's not always applied the same way, but it can be done in every aspect, even if the system's barter. It's the concept that's important of being able to do that. And it's very important to note that most of the individuals involved in this stuff, they're just taking orders. They're foot soldiers, if you will. So you take a group here, and they invest all their money in this one area together, right? And it looks like they artificially create a flood of wealth into an area. And then together they pull out all of what they've put in, and everybody else does the same thing, and then suddenly you have a collapse. That's one simple explanation of how to do this sort of mechanism. And there's words for it. There's dumping for products, right? Selling products, short selling products intentionally to cause damage and things like that, right? But when it comes to the actual currency itself, it's a little bit different and a little bit more difficult. But in the same way, it's actually easier if you quote unquote control that currency. And that's where it really comes down to who controls the currency. And if you are controlling the currency, what is your motive behind your different actions with control of that currency? And of course, then the question being, should you continue to be allowed to control the currency if you're obviously intentionally, your motives are not, are for the benefit of this particular group or this particular individual, and you're doing this little game of stretching stuff out on purpose to cause this constant disequilibrium and all that stuff. There's always going to be natural, things like that, but I would say mostly it's been manipulated globally, the currency. That might take a little bit more time to explain all the different aspects of being able to change the scales and deflate, inflate, or pull up and pull down the lever of the currency lever. So some terms for valuation that are important. I already mentioned real value. The next one is accepted value. So first we'll just start with real value again. It's anything that's usable or practical. Its value is in its use. Accepted value is in whether it's desired or wanted. You could have an object that's useful, say jewelry, right? Jewelry is an object that's useful for wearing. Now it's going to be wanted or unwanted dependent upon the sex, being male or female, of the purchaser and for whom they're purchasing it. The next one, of course, is declared value. Well, I say of course, but not necessarily. Declared value is the next one, and that's anything which is stated or printed, which may or may not align with the real and accepted value. You can have things that are perfectly useless, especially knickknacks that break or garbage or whatever, who's got really bad reviews. But the stated value does not relate to the actual usefulness of that product, and then, of course, because of bad reviews, won't be wanted or accepted, and therefore, all that. You can eliminate the bad reviews, and then it might be desired or wanted, and then everybody that gets it has a bad experience, makes a bad review, and the review gets eliminated, so it still essentially has accepted value, but it doesn't have any useful value. And its declared value doesn't apply to the useful value, so on and so forth. There's a bunch of different examples we can use for this. And then, of course, the last one is fictitious value, which relates to loans and stocks, bonds, balance sheets, etc. So getting into this book, World Finance, 1935 to 1937, by Paul Einzig, we're going to read just a couple of pages. On page 103, subsection 4, President Roosevelt's reflation, American public not inflation-minded. Had he pursued a less orthodox method of treasury financing, a fraction of the actual amount extended would have produced a more pronounced effect upon the price level in the United States. As it was, the inflationary pronouncements he made from time to time were unable to carry much conviction. The American public simply refused to become inflation-minded. That's the problem that we have today. The American public is, in fact, inflation-minded. Although this was an essential condition for a pronounced rise in commodity prices, in this respect, the attitude of the American public was similar to that of the public in the European belligerent countries during the first 2 years of the war, when, in spite of the presence of wholesale inflation, commodity prices were reluctant to rise. That is a big deal. And then we move on to, because I believe that's really the important part. I mean, we can get into the rest of that paragraph and all the little details and whatnot, but that's really the key issue there. Debtor's dictatorship. In this respect, Dr. Schacht handled the situation with masterly skill. Having realized that in the existing state of the world, creditors are at the mercy of their debtors, he endeavored to accumulate as large commercial arrears as possible. He concluded exchange clearing agreements with a large number of countries and aimed at accumulating a huge debt balance. Having done so, he informed the countries in question that the only way in which these balances could possibly be cleared was through an increase of their purchases of German goods. As a result, Yugoslavia, Greece, and a number of other countries had to buy German goods in order to get payment for their exports, even if the price quoted to get payment for their exports by German exporters was not competitive and if the quality was inferior. Thanks to such skillful tactics, Germany managed to somehow produce an export surplus in spite of the overvaluation of the Reichsmark. From the point of view of the trade balance, the devaluation was not therefore desperately urgent. Nor did considerations of internal equilibrium demand a devaluation of the Reichsmark, at any rate at the present stage. Notwithstanding the huge amounts spent on rearmament since the advent of the National Socialist government, the internal indebtedness per head of the population was still lower in Germany than in most countries. It was incomparably lower than in either France or Great Britain or even in the United States. The burden of the public debt was not unbearable on the basis of existing value of the Reichsmark, and but for rearmament and public works expenditure, it would be easy to balance the budget. It is true that the public debt had been increasing since 1933 at a pace which was without precedent in time of peace. But even if this increase were to continue at the present pace, it would by some time before the burden of indebtedness became so excessive as to necessitate devaluation as it has in France. And there you get the reason for World War II. Simply put, if you remove and negate the ability to use the debt instrument to manipulate the currency lever and virtually everything else, you effectively remove the control mechanism of this financier enemy cabal. They could not have that at all costs. And so they pull out all stops. They set to work all their financial mechanisms to pull the strings of all the information systems to engage in propaganda and lies and rumors, the big rumor mill that comes out of the church and the school and you find replicated everywhere, all the, the water cooler talk, so to speak. That mechanism is leveraged to form a real attack on the ones who have basically got the goods, who have figured out what the game is and are implementing a strategy, an effective strategy to deal with it. Essentially speaking, World War II, as far as Germany is concerned, was all about negating the ability to remove the debt control. You find a lot of that playing out today, of course, in a slightly different fashion, but pretty much the same way. And that's really what it comes down to. There's wars for other different reasons, and most of them are instigated by these financiers. In fact, perhaps all of them are. But in this context, it was an absolute necessity for their survival. They had to destroy Germany economically, or physically, they had to destroy Germany. Hence the next preceding occupation split into two halves and all that other stuff. But what it really was about was the fact that they figured out a way to win the economic war. And that is a big problem. Now, it's possible that the reason why the cabal elements have been able to so successfully continue is the fact that they have, essentially speaking, evaded physical destruction. And that's where we get to our next element, which is identifying the enemy. Now, the first thing that's important, as is generally the case, is that you need to set up the stage, right? If you go to a theater, you have to set the stage, you have to put all the little pieces in their places and all that stuff, right? You need the backdrop, everything. Well, I don't know if no once, but most people don't want to go on a stage if they're playing a certain character and not be in the proper setting, right? You don't want to go on a stage dressed up as a Roman soldier and your backdrop is a whole bunch of like speaker boosters and like techno lights and stuff for like a cyberpunk rock band or something. So the first thing to set this stage is the simple and absolute declaration that the state is invalid. You have all these people that throw out stuff like, I want less government, I want more government, it doesn't matter, all these words or whatever. But the fact is that the current state of things and the current entity that calls itself the state is not valid and is illegitimate. In the context of something being legitimate as being valid through them being situated in customary or historical pretexts or through documentation, the legality of it, right? I am not using the current term for that the mind control propaganda system of the university uses, which is that legitimacy is based off of people's opinions, right? So-called government show, as was in my political science class, a so-called government enjoys good legitimacy if the regular majority of the population recognizes them as legitimate. No, that's not how it works. You are either legitimate or you're not, and it doesn't matter if people are, in general, are hoodwinked into believing that you are legitimate. That doesn't legitimize you, right? Eventually, the fraud will be found out, and you will be. And so, a good way to state it, as I found, is that the state is invalid. It is not valid. The state is not the state referenced in the Constitution. And if they're not constitutional, then that calls into a bunch of other questions. So first we're going to talk about some of the main arguments and, of course, how they twist the words to argue about it. So here's the thing. When you want to invalidate the state, you need to find something that definitively cannot be argued. It's black and white. You can't argue your way out of it. Of course, they could suppress it and lie about it, and they can make up, whatever criticisms they would like or whatever. I suppose you can argue your way out of something, but this invalidation of the state is not just about argument. It's about formulating it in your own mind that you are correct. You do not want to be on shaky ground here. You want it to be completely and absolutely understood in your own mind that you are correct, and then that transfers on to other people. You need to be stable. You need to be able to withstand twisted words. And that is the big thing. When you come to with the United States specifically, and this is going to be the same with every country, first you have to conceptualize the state's invalid, okay? That's everything. Everything in the state. Absolutely everything. All the employees, all the buildings, all their declarations, their control over the internet, every single thing they do or say or under what guise or what nonsense, they as an entity, as a structure, not only are they invalid, but they are an enemy. They are not the valid structure, okay? So that's the first thing you recognize. Now with the United States specifically, the invalidity of the state can be easily found in very specific sections of the Constitution. The first relates to Article 1, Section 2, Line 3, which states that direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within the Union according to their respective numbers. Then you have no capitation. Now, capitation comes to the word capital, meaning head. And that's when we were looking at this financial thing, it referenced debt to head count ratio, right? The head count. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So you have a lot of direct taxes that are, first of all, not laid in proportion. Now here's the thing. If you have an entity that comes along doing something specifically not laid out in the documents, they are not that entity. If you go to a corporation and they've written all these bylaws and all this other stuff and they refuse to follow their bylaws, well, they're not that corporation, are they? That corporation is simply a piece of dead paper that means nothing, and they are something else. They are not valid. You go to articles of formation, right? Articles of incorporation or articles of amendment or articles of anything. Any articles relating to the structure of a corporation. And this is just a simple concept. And you write in there how the corporation is going to function. And then this other corporation, bearing the same name and possibly having followed those previously, now is not. They're not valid and they're not that corporation. They're not following it. And that's what we have. We have entities going around saying they are empowered to do this stuff because their name aligns with this document, and yet they're not following the practical operational measures of that document. Therefore, they are not the entity listed in that document. Now you can argue, of course, about the fact that a state proportioning direct taxes is doing so based off of the number of people in that state and all this other nonsense. And that fraud is just so happens. But there is one thing in the Constitution, well, there's many things in the Constitution, but there's one specifically that really just narrows it down perfectly. That there is absolutely no way to argue validity. And when you point this one out, they get it. And it becomes two sides fully aware that you're both enemies. But like I said before, this is not about argument. Article 1, Section 8, Line 5 states that Congress has the responsibility, mind you, not the right, not the privilege, not any of that stuff, the responsibility to coin money, regulate the value, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Congress fixes the standard of weights and measures, and yet, when you go to the gas pump, it states approved by the department or office, the state of standard of weights and measures with the county auditor or something like that. The states are fixing the standards of weights and measures. That invalidates both. It invalidates Congress, which is just public theater and completely fake, and it invalidates the states, which are simply occupational corporations acting on behalf of foreign interests. There's no way that you can claim that you are a constitutional state when you're fixing the standards of weights and measures and it's not Congress. And like I said before, there's always, they can argue through out of this or whatnot, but these are concrete. The no other direct taxes, when you know that the fact that the operational document of the Constitution is about everybody being taxed equally based off of your head count. And that's the only way you can fund your entity. That's where the funding comes from. That's the organizational structure. And they're not following that. And they're doing all this rampant crap. They're not what they say they are. And it's the same thing here. When you also have international standardization organizations mandating things throughout the United States, these entities are enforcing them. These entities are not constitutional. They are invalid. Now, of course, you have the Second Amendment, and you have the establishment of post offices and post roads in relation to the fraudulent management by state departments of transportation and the licensing and the registration of motor vehicles and things like that. And then, of course, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin and tender in payments of debt. Well, they would say, of course, in the states that they're not the ones making gold and silver coin and tender payments and debts. It's the Department of the Treasury for the federal government, all this other nonsense. So there's always some kind of argument. But if you're going to formulate it into your mind of the invalidation of the state and know that you are correct in your stance, you are concrete, and that when you face these people, you know you're facing an enemy. And they know that they're an enemy, and they know, you're, of course, that's how it goes, right? You need to be able to understand, and when you have a brainwashing system that tries to blur the lines, you need to come in and make those lines bold and clear for yourself, and then that can be done with other people too, and you can make allies. If you don't know who the enemy is, then you can't fight them. You can't make any determinations, and you can't strategize, and you can't protect yourself, and you don't know what you're dealing with. You need to be able to understand your enemy. Part of that has to do with ignoring their arguments and ignoring their bullcrap, right? As they say, don't BS a BSer or whatever. But you have to be able to ignore that and put it out of your mind, but then you also have to stabilize within your own mind, and then that in reference or in turn will stabilize it in others, that you know who you're dealing with. And the first one is that the so-called state and the current entity calling itself government today is not valid. In the preamble of the Constitution, it is just like a mission statement that any company would issue, and it's basically just what is the purpose of this organizational structure. It is to make a more perfect union, meaning the union beforehand wasn't perfect, meaning that this union is not new. So that's the big question. What is the more perfect union, and what's the union beforehand that wasn't very perfect, or that needs to be perfected? That needs to become more perfect, right? Second is justice. And that's not the Declaration of Justice, that's the concept of justice, in which we don't have the concept of justice. There is no justice, people point that out all the day, every day. This guy goes to prison, and the sentence is imbalanced or whatever, and things don't appear to be done justly. It's like justice and judgment, right? You've got good judgment and good justice in your everyday life and all that stuff. And then you got bad justice and bad judgment, right? So justice, it's just declared. Now, they would argue that that doesn't necessarily mean good or bad justice. It just means justice in general. And that's, of course, how the word twisting goes. Next one is domestic tranquility. And with the word twisting, that becomes everybody's internal household. In order to maintain domestic tranquility within the home, you need to have all of these measurements to track what people do inside their house, and how they're talking between their spouses, how they're, everything. It needs to be like embedded so that you can micromanage every single detail of people's lives from when they wake up to when they go to bed. And even, of course, when they're dreaming, you need to be able to regulate that too. That's what they've turned it into with their domestic violence nonsense. But in fact, domestic tranquility, of course, is more like the domestic gross product, GDP, gross domestic product, which relates to the domestic domicile of the entity. Common defense, boy, do we not have that. You have the common defense for them, but the rest of us have no common defense. We're simply hostages, and they don't really give a crap what happens to us. General welfare, same thing. Sixth, liberty, boy, do we not have. We don't have virtually any liberties. Right? You can't walk outside and not have some regulation or rule you're supposed to follow about where you can walk, about what you can do, about whether or not you can breathe in a certain area, whether you can stand here, right? You got all these signs that say no loitering, no trespassing. And then, of course, trespassing is misconstrued to mean you can't walk around here, or you can't drive over here, all that stuff, right? So that's the preamble. And that basically lists out exactly what the purpose of the document is, and virtually nothing in the preamble is actually a state of affairs right now. And that's because the state's invalid. Period. No discussion. It just is not valid. All the state governments, all the state of so-and-so, invalid. All the office buildings with the people, invalid. The state that the Constitution's referencing, very obviously, are the geographical states. The location with a certain population. That's what it's talking about. It's not talking about, the state of Mississippi. It's talking about the geographical bordered region of Mississippi. And these are just general concepts which have been blurred so that people can't identify the fact that their enemy is in fact occupying them and belligerently ordering you to do stuff without valid authority. Next is superior pretext. You have to establish superior pretext. And I don't mean superior pretext in terms of argument again. I don't give a crap about argument, and I don't care about critical thinking. You just have to ignore it. And it's white noise. The superior pretext that we have here is the oath of enlistment, commission, and office. And we have Article 4, Section 2, which stipulates that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. When you have people that swear oaths of allegiance to the supreme law of the land, it means it's the supreme law. It's not the subject to other laws supreme law, and it's not the you can do it if you want, or we can argue about the little, itty-bitty stuff. It is the supreme law of the land. It is what's enforced, and if you swear an oath of allegiance to it, and that's the other thing here. This is for superior pretext. This is so that when you write out your documentation and when you do things like that, you are stable. You are strong. Your position is not weak. Somebody will read what you say and they say, that's true. And, other people come along and say things like, oh, well, it's not signed or blah, blah, blah. It doesn't obviously take away from the information put in there. Now, if you put little arguments in there or questions or you want to talk about the legitimacy or legality, well, now you're on weak footing, right? You are not stable. You need to be stable, and you need superior pretext. What I mean by superior pretext is the ability to write things which comes from a superior position as far as force is concerned in many cases. In this context, you are invoking the oaths of enlistment of the armed forces to say that if you swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, you do not have a choice. You have a duty and responsibility to the supreme law of the land, period. No matter what they say about whether or not civil controls are in effect to ensure that no military assets are operating on foreign soil, that's coming from an invalid entity. They have no standing, period. And if you swear an oath of allegiance, you are forced to act through that oath, and if you do not, then you are in dereliction of duty and you have violated your oath, and bad things can be done to you based off of that inaction. That's what I mean by superior pretext. This is not room for argument. This is not room for declarations or all this other little bitty critical thinking crap that you get on, Google and online in the school system. This is warfare against an invalid state acting enemy who is occupying unlawfully the territory of the, at least at this point, the dead letter institution or entity of that the U.S. Constitution lays out. Next thing, of course, is to take effective measures. You can't just live in the land of fantasy and believe that just because you're right, that that's enough. You need to take effective measures. One of these would be raising the militia, but by other means, going out and finding allies and taking very specific actions which will have an effect. The term militia has been so maneuvered to mean quote-unquote militia groups or the so-called sovereign citizen or any of these other things like that, that word itself has been essentially eliminated from use. So another thing you could say is I need to get to, if we've got all these enemies that are intending to do us harm and including and working together and calling themselves the so-called government, then who else do you turn to? Well, your neighbors, the people you live near. Anybody else who's got some type of a quote-unquote injured party, right? You look at that legal concept of somebody who's an injured party, they're somebody who's also being abused, and then you've got the idea of a class action lawsuit. Well, that's not what this is. This is about taking effective measures. You're not going to get anywhere taking out a class action lawsuit when you're trying to go to when the entity that's going to administer that class action lawsuit is the same entity causing the damage and waging the war. Which means you need to be effective, and one of those things means stop arguing, stop complaining, and stop whining. None of those things are going to do anything. You have to take effective actions. And those could change depending on the situation and the locale, right? Wherever it is, those effective measures will be different. Obviously, people who live in rural communities are more familiar with this. They know that so-called 911 is not, 10 minutes away, as they would say. It's possibly 2-3 hours. And so they rely on each other. You take away, of course, the fact that 911 is in fact a support mechanism, and you think if I call 911, I probably won't be walking out alive because I'm calling an enemy to come help me. That's stupid. And once you get that clear in your mind, the situation becomes a lot simpler for what you need to do. You need to prepare yourself to act on your own abilities, and of course you need to find those you can trust. And often a lot of the people that we think we can trust, they turn out you can't. Family members, right? You can do little tests with family members to see how they will, right? The term fair weather friends is applicable. If you have friends who are only with you when things are good and comfortable, and they won't do things that make them uncomfortable, or they won't go out of their way for you, they're not dependable. And it could be something simple like if they won't. I don't mean anything to deal with money, right? I don't mean that. I mean if they don't show up to events, if they don't invest time, and if they treat you like you're only there to benefit them, then they are definitely not going to help you if you're in a problematic situation, and they will believe whatever garbage they're told about you. You're a terrorist, you're a pedophile, you're doing this or that or whatever, and all of course, coming out of the invalid state, which will use any artifice, mantle, or lie to get what they want. And I do mean the employees that work in the structure too. Absolutely. The collections office manager has no trouble calling 911 and hoping that a SWAT unit and a whole bunch of other people come in and kick down your door because you're 3 months late on their fictitious and fraudulent, unlawful, direct taxation based off of your property. That's not based off of the census numbers. That's not based off population. That's based off of what they say your property is valued at. That's a direct tax or capitation in proportion to property value. That's not constitutional, therefore they're not valid. And there's so many things like that. So once you figure out the effective measures you take, and so they could be really simple, like going around and removing the signs, right? The unlawful signage, right? The fake construction, stuff like that. Now the next thing is to monitor and map activity. You need to be able to know what the enemy's doing. That means you go around and you look at, say, excessive utility construction. I mean, there's a lot of that going on right now. Odd behavior, anomalies, and an influx in out-of-towners, right? Construction, and you can, even if they've got all the appropriate identification, right? They got in-state plates and they got all this other stuff. Well, their driving habits might be different, and we're just talking about driving right now. They might, where in an area where people drive slowly because there's children that play in the street and somebody comes in and they're zipping down and they're going like 100 miles an hour. Well, that's clearly not a person from the neighborhood or from the area. And you see that a lot where you've got these so-called city vehicles, right? The city of so-and-so, and they're freaking hauling, they're like a bat out of hell through a local neighborhood where children play and where most people drive maybe 50 miles an hour, right? That's behavior that's odd. Now, I'm not, of course, talking about the validity of school zones and all this other nonsense, because that's all invalid too. And the fact that people, in fact, should have quote-unquote speed limits and all this other nonsense. A limit on your speed, right? Not a limit on their speed, but a limit on your speed. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about people's general customs in an area, and you're looking for the ones that stand out. And a lot of them are going to be connected to so-called government, because a lot of this, what they call the continuity of government happens to do with subcontracting and obviously the most fake law enforcement now are subcontracted security guards, which creates a whole nother problem in itself. And then, of course, the next one are obviously malicious acts. In general, people who live in an area are not going to take obviously malicious actions against themselves. That's what somebody does to those, they won't gain the repercussions of taking that malicious activity. Now, of course, there are people that will do that, but they won't do it in general in the context of comprehending that it's going to have bad repercussions for them. You take an individual who's been slighted, usually a woman, as far as relationships go, and she'll go out and slash the tires of her boyfriend or key the car, right? That's just, everybody thinks that that's totally normal behavior and perfectly fine, right? A guy walks out one day and his car got keyed or his tire got slashed, and they're going to say, oh, did you make your girlfriend mad or something like that, right? It's recognized as normal. However, that malicious act could eventually affect her too, because if her car breaks down and her boyfriend's car is toast, well, now they're both stuck, right? So, but that malicious act wasn't intended through the perspective that it would have repercussions for the one doing it. If you have somebody who's taking malicious actions and it could have serious repercussions for them, say, somebody who lives in an area wants to get to work on time, they're probably not going to intentionally cause traffic congestion around their house, They're probably not going to set up scaffolding, and a whole bunch of other stuff around their house so that they can't do anything there, you know. Now they might do it for a different purpose, and that's of course where the analysis and the discernment comes in. You know, somebody's not going to go usually set fire to their house unless of course they've got some sort of insurance scheme going on. They're not going to intentionally destroy all of their belongings, right? You know, they're not going to drive their car into a lake for no reason. People don't do that. There's always a reason. And even if the individual isn't doing it, somebody else is doing it for a reason. So now we can get into a little bit of an example, a piece of evidence here. This is from 104 East Main Street, Lancaster, Ohio 43130. The so-called City Hall, Lancaster Historic District. Now, under land use, and this is from Snyder Beacon, their property valuation structure, it states exempt property owned by municipals. Most of people would think a municipality is a city, but in this context, it sounds like they're using the word municipals as though they were individuals, right? It's like saying it's owned by trustees, or it's owned, well, of course you could have a quote-unquote city trustee, but it's owned by, iron workers, right? That's how it seems like they're using the word municipals here. That's important as far as functionality goes. Now, the owner has the same address as the location owned, which is 104 East Main Street. It has room 107, so they have that distinction there. Now, there's a lot of other weird stuff that pops up on this. First, it states, disclaimer, acreage and lot sizes within this section do not represent the legal survey or deed acreage of the parcel. Lot sizes shown here are intended for valuation purposes only. Now, that's important, but I don't really want to get into the reason why, because I don't want a really long video. Next is the structure is considered religious. That's interesting. And then under use type, we have sport area. Under permits from, October 5th, 2015, you have the permit number of 1509DV, amount of $0 and purpose unknown. That's interesting. Now, I've been to this building myself, and this schematic explains nothing. If you look up a schematic of a two-story multi-family home, maybe 2-bedroom, 1 bath, or 2-bedroom, 2-bath, or whatever, condo, it will have every floor, every subsection, all the garage, everything perfectly laid out. Well, this building right here definitely does not relate to this schematic. That, I believe, should be very obvious. Currently, this building is completely surrounded by scaffolding. Very little construction. Obviously, that scaffolding is for another purpose. Anybody who has any type of experience in security knows that when you're securing a building, you need to restrict access. That is the intention behind this. You only have one entry point, which is very congested and very tight. The other entry is blocked by sidewalk closed signs, which you can still get to, but you have to ignore the signs to get there. This is about entry control points, or ECPs, which is very well known within any security circles, whether it be military, whether it be subcontractors, security guards, it doesn't matter. This construction project is the cover for entry control points. And now we get into a very simple understanding for what these construction projects are actually about, and that includes on the highways. The intentional congestion of traffic is to restrict entry. It is for formulation of an entry control point. And just that. It's not about the construction, it's about funneling people through. Now, as far as this goes, it's so that, people who go into this building and go out are constantly, their movements are controlled. Their entries controlled, their exits controlled, etc. And that's a security reason. It's the same thing with traffic.